Hello, it's the 22nd of August 2024. Today would have been Ray Bradbury's 104th birthday. So welcome to Bradbury 100 Live. Now, why do I do this live? I don't know. I normally do this as an audio podcast, Bradbury 100, but once a year on Ray's birthday for the past 4 years, I've been doing a live edition, Livestreamed, where I take the risk of talking absolute nonsense, and I've got no way of going back and editing it, so I just hope everything comes out for the best. This year, I thought I'd give you a peek behind the curtain and talk about how I put together my chronological Bradbury series. Now, this is a strand within the Bradbury 100 podcast that I do every now and again, where the aim is to go through every one of Ray's stories from beginning to end, from the beginning of his career to the last thing that he ever published, really. And so that means there's a very huge span of time to cover. There's a huge number of stories to cover, and I've so far only managed to cover a few of those years. I've started with 1938, which was the year that Ray Bradbury published his first piece of fiction, and I've got to about 1942. So there's a long way to go because he lived until 2012, and he was writing right up to the day he died. So he was a very busy writer. In a moment, I'll show you some statistics relating to Bradbury's stories. But the main thing I'm going to do today is go through how I research and prepare one of these chronological Bradbury episodes. To do that, I'll show you some things from my website, some other web resources that are out there, and I'll also show you some of the things from my collection. I've got a pile of books here, which you can't see because it's out of view of the camera, but I'll go through some of the research sources that I use when I'm working on Bradbury 100 and other projects that I work on. Now, let's talk about Ray Bradbury a little bit before we go any further. Of course, he was born in 1920. He published many books over the years, the most famous of which is Fahrenheit 451, which came out in 1953. And that means he was 33 years old when that came out. So his most famous work was done by the time he was in his early 30s. He went on to publish fiction all the way through to, as I say, almost his dying days. His last piece of writing was published more or less the day before he died. And there are lots of stories to cover. Let me give you those statistics now. So here's an interesting graph. Well, it's interesting to me. This is a summary of Ray's published fiction from more or less beginning to end. He first started publishing in 1938, so that's what the very left-hand column is on this graph. But look how many stories he published in these early years. There's a little peak around 1940, and then there's a massive surge of activity reaching the grandest peak of all in 1950. So by the time Ray was 30 years old, he'd already published a substantial amount of his short story material. And of course, he's best known really as a short story writer. He wrote novels, but many of his books are collections of short stories or short stories stitched together to make something that looks like a novel. The Martian Chronicles is such a novel. Dandelion Wine is such a novel. It's just part of his process. And I might say some more about that later. But back to the graph. So you see this big peak in 1950? That coincides, well, it's not a coincidence actually, but that coincides with the publication of the Martian Chronicles. 1950 is when the Martian Chronicles appeared. Now, Ray wrote some new material for the Martian Chronicles, so as well as publishing short stories in magazines, he was writing new stuff that appeared in his books around this time. So that partly contributes to 1950 having a big peak, a whole bunch of new material coming out in that 1 year. Notice how things then seem to decline, and quite rapidly after that. So why that decline? Why would his short story output go down so rapidly after 1950? Well, the simple answer is, there's two parts to the answer. The first part is that in the 1950s, he was publishing books. His focus had shifted from writing as many short stories as he could and getting them published in magazines. He was now focused on gathering those short stories, pre-existing material. He's already written and sold once. He's now gathering it together to make his books. Martian Chronicles, Illustrated Man, even Dandelion Wine is, it looks like a novel, but it's made up of stories previously published. So in the 1950s, his focus has shifted somewhat from short stories to collecting short stories and making them into novels. So the mid to late 50s, there's this decline in his short story output. The other factor is that in 1953, he goes off to Ireland to work with John Huston on the screenplay for Moby Dick. And he spends best part of a year, well actually it's more like 6 months, but a huge amount of his time is taken up by this non-short story activity, in particular working on Moby Dick. So if I point at some of the columns here, let's find 1953. Here we are. This is 1953, the blue column. That's when he goes off to Ireland. 1954 is when he comes back from Ireland, having completed the work on Moby Dick. And really his short story output declines away until we reach this point here. There's a whole year where he doesn't publish any short stories. And that's 1968. So why would Ray Bradbury, famed short story writer, not publish any short stories in 1968? Well, in the 1960s, Ray was mostly working in Hollywood, Broadway, and writing poetry. His focus had shifted again away from short stories, and he was trying to establish himself as a screenwriter, as a playwriter, and as a poet, with mixed success. I might talk about those parallel careers in some future episode of Bradbury 100. But all of that activity, all of that non-short story activity meant that he didn't write many short stories during this time, or he didn't publish many short stories. There's a mini surge smack in the middle there after 1 year where he didn't publish a single short story. Suddenly, in 1969, he goes up to 8 short stories. That is the happy accident, if you like, that he published a book in 69. He published I Sing the Body Electric, which had a number of stories that had never appeared before. So he'd been writing those stories during the 60s and earlier, but only collected them together in 69, hence this little peak. The other interesting thing, though, towards the end of Ray's career, there's this other set of spikes up here. This green one is 1997, and he published a couple of books in very quick succession, Quicker Than the Eye and Driving Blind, which mostly collected some previously recorded stories and some new stories. But because there was this flurry of activity with 2 new books in very rapid succession, you get these spikes at the end. And this spike here, 2002, I think is the year of either the Cat's Pajamas short story collection or One More for the Road. I'd have to actually look that up because my mind's got a blank and I can't remember which book came out in 2002. But that is the map of Bradbury's career, that early surge of activity and then a relative decline in short story activity and then a peak towards the end of his career. This, incidentally, is why many people who have studied Bradbury have made the mistake of thinking that they can stop around about 1980. This little bump here where my mouse is, that's the year 1980. That year several books of scholarship on Ray Bradbury came out. His books and stories were being taught in schools. There were documentary films made about him and his work. And at this point, he was 60 years old. And I think a lot of people assumed, well, that's it. Bradbury, done and dusted. His career is now complete. And so it's almost as if scholars had drawn a line under Bradbury and said, that's it, nothing more to study. But after that, he had a big comeback. He wrote a trilogy of novels, Death is a Lonely Business, Graveyard for Lunatics, Let's All Kill Constance. And he published this flurry of short story collections as well. So there's quite a lot of new Bradbury material after 1980. But if you look at the scholarship, you don't find much concentration on that. So that's been one of my aims as an academic, is to try and get other academics interested in considering the whole sweep of Bradbury's career. I've got one other graph here just to bore you with statistics. Have a look at this one. This shows you the cumulative total, how many stories Ray had written in total as time goes on. So again, this one reveals, I'll just run it again, and look how quickly the graph rises at the beginning, and then it levels off a bit. And then there's another little rise towards the end. So this again is the demonstration that Bradbury's career had these huge surges in activity. The major one in the first 15, maybe 20 years of his career, from 1938 to about 1958. And the second surge is in the last 20 or so years of his career. The other thing that this graph reveals, and I've only taken the graph to 2003 because when I was putting the statistics together, that's really where my information came to an end. There are some other stories published after 2003, but that's more or less as far as I got when I was putting this together. The other thing this reveals is that the total number of stories Ray had published up to 2003 is about 400 stories. Ray Bradbury published in his lifetime over 400 short stories. On my podcast, Bradbury 100, I naively stated one day, I'm going to do chronological Bradbury. I'm going to consider every one of Ray Bradbury's short stories from the day he first started publishing them right through to the very end. And some people said to me, oh, that's interesting. How long is it going to take you to get through them all? And I said, well, I don't know, probably a couple of years. Now, having started to do these chronological Bradbury things, this is my logo for the chronological Bradbury sequence. The first couple of episodes, I was able to concentrate on a single year. So, for example, if I go back to my graph, for example, in the first year of Bradbury's career as a writer, he only published 3 stories. So I was able to talk about all of those in one episode of the podcast. By the time we get to 1940, he's publishing 9 stories in a year. I can talk about 9 stories in a single podcast episode. It's a bit of a stretch, possibly a bit tedious for the listener, but I can do it. But, oh my, what am I going to do when I get to 1950 and there are 24 stories to consider? Am I going to do a single podcast episode that deals with all 24 stories? If I do, it might be an extremely long episode, or it might be a very cursory look at those 24 stories. The more likely thing is, though, that I will chop it up. I will divide that into maybe 4 episodes. So on that basis, it could take me a very long time to get through all of Ray's stories. He published over 400, and let's just call up the cumulative graph again, because I know you love it. To get through those 400 stories, well, if I averaged 4 stories an episode, that would take me 100 episodes of my podcast. Yeah, it's going to take a long time. So how do I do it? What do I do? And well, I could ask why I do it. I don't know why I do it. I'm just fascinated by Bradbury's career, and I know other people are as well. So I do like to delve into where these stories came from, how they changed over the years, because Ray didn't tend to just write a story and say, that's it, done. He would write it, and then he would come back to it at some point. In interviews, he would often say, I don't believe in rewriting my former self or my younger self. But that is clearly not true, because he did rewrite his younger self. He would, if nothing else, he would take his old short stories, stitch them together to make a novel. One of these from the later part of his career is From the Dust Returned, which collects together all of his Elliot family stories, Uncle Einar and the April Witch, all of these stories about this fanciful family of fantasy characters. He'd written those over decades, starting in the 1940s, possibly even earlier than that. But then he grabbed them all together, stitched them up with some new material, and put it out as a novel in about 2002, I think, From the Dust Returned. So this was Ray's working method. He would write something and then he would repurpose it. And he would do the same with film and television. He would take his short stories and he would adapt them for screen. And in the process, he didn't do a literal adaptation of his stories. What he tended to do is rewrite them as if he was writing the story afresh. So I've always maintained that Ray Bradbury's authorship is all about rewriting, repurposing. Cynically, you could say repackaging, but I don't believe he was doing any of this for a financial motive. I believe he was doing it because that's how he was driven as a writer, to always go back, always look for the new way of telling that story and telling it better. So, in order to tell the story of Ray's stories, I have to look at the history of the stories. I don't want to just say, here's a story and this is what it's about. What I want to do is give people an indication of where that story first appeared, how it may have changed over time when Ray went from magazine to book, and that kind of thing. So there's some research involved. Some of it is up here, most of it isn't, but it's in the various resources that I have at my fingertips. So I'm now going to start talking about the pile of books here. Well, and some other things. It occurred to me the other day that not everybody is thoroughly familiar with the terminology that I sometimes use. So I think it's worth just explaining a couple of things. When Ray began his writing career, he was first of all writing for fanzines. So he was writing for amateur magazines, including his own. He had a fanzine called Futuria Fantasia. And in the podcast, you'll have heard me talk about that quite a bit, because a number of his early stories first appeared in Futuria Fantasia. I don't have any copies of Futuria Fantasia. I do have the book, which I have forgotten to put out in my pile. This is the perils of doing live streaming. There is a book version of Futuria Fantasia, and that collects every issue in facsimile. So it's just like having the real issues of Ray's amateur magazines. Before he was a writer, he was a fan, and he produced a fanzine. Then, when he became a professional writer, he was selling stories to what we call pulp magazines. Now, in other YouTube videos, I've said that I'm not really a collector. And I do collect to an extent, but I'm nowhere near as avid a collector as some of my friends and colleagues in the Bradbury world. But I do have a handful of pulp magazines, and I keep them in the plastic bag, as you're supposed to do. Pulp magazines are notorious for decaying, so if you shake them in the bag, you sometimes get a little collection of brown paper dust gathering in the corner. This is an old Thrilling Wonder Stories, which contains a Bradbury story. I don't have many of these. This is my grand total of Thrilling Wonders. I have 2 issues of those. So those are Bradbury's. Issues with Bradbury stories in them. The thing about the pulp magazines is that these were plentiful in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the 1950s. And if you were a beginning writer in any genre, there would be pulp magazines that you could contribute to, and you'd be paid per word. So the longer the story, the more you got paid. The thing about pulp magazines, they were the popular entertainment of the day. Today, when people want to chill out, they come home from work, they switch on the TV, or they switch on Netflix, or they go on the internet. Back in the day, there was no TV, there was radio. You could listen to that, people did, but then people need something to do while they're listening to the radio. They need to occupy their hands or their eyes because they don't know where to look. So people would read the newspaper while listening to the radio. They'd read pulp magazines. Here's another one. This is a Planet Stories, which has a Bradbury story, and in fact quite a famous Bradbury story, Lorelei of the Red Mist, which is a collaboration between Bradbury and Lee Brackett. So pulp magazines is how Bradbury got his early career kick-started, and he was writing mostly for Weird Tales magazine. I don't have any of those. I literally don't have a single copy of Weird Tales, but I'll show you in a moment what I use instead of physical copies of magazines if I need access to these early stories. But Ray appeared in lots of pulps in the 1940s. And then, as his career took off, as the quality of his writing was recognised, he began to transfer to what are called slick magazines. Now, I don't have very many of these in my collection. Let me just put this down somewhere. I don't have very many of the slick magazines in my collection. What I tend to do is, if there is a story which has never been collected in Ray's books, and it has only appeared in some slick magazine from the 1950s, I will try and seek out that slick magazine. I've got one here, which this really is classed as a slick. I'm not going to pick this one up because it's a bit fragile, but I will turn the pages a little bit. So this is a Collier's magazine from 1954. So now what's the difference between the pulps and the slick? One of them is a tendency for there to be a difference in size. So there's a size comparison of a typical pulp and this slick magazine, Collier's. Collier's was a kind of a general family magazine, so there'd be articles in there for dad, there'd be articles in there for mum, might be something in there for the kids, but probably not. Here's the table of contents over here for this Collier's issue, and this one contains a short story by Ray on page 10, and it's called The Marriage Mender, and in brackets, the short story. I would have picked up this issue of Collier's from eBay or somewhere, simply because it's got a Bradbury story in there that I wanted a copy of. But a lot of these magazines, I don't have these originals at all. I just have a few samples of things that I really needed and didn't have access to any other way. Ray, in the 1950s then, was writing for these slick magazines. He was also starting to put out books. And as his career went on, of course, he became even more famous. Probably, therefore, he was a more expensive writer for magazines to hire. And what Ray would tend to do, or his agent would tend to do, is when Ray had written a story, the agent would decide which magazine to send it to. So they might say, well, okay, we'll start with Playboy because Playboy pays really well, so we'll send it to Playboy. Playboy buys the story. There you go. It will appear sometime next year. Playboy rejects the story. Okay, let's send it to another men's magazine, another magazine in a similar marketplace, paying a similar amount of money. And the stories would circulate and go through magazine after magazine until a buyer was found. Sometimes the stories wouldn't sell, and Ray would just keep them in his drawers, and he could then just publish them in a book later on. But more often than not, as he became a famous name, his stories would sell, because magazines would be very keen to have a Bradbury story, even if it's not the best story he's ever written. Don't say I said that. So Bradbury's stories begin to appear in books in the 1950s. He wasn't just appearing in pulp magazines. He was also pulps and slicks. He was also appearing in all sorts of other things. This is, for example, this is a 1951 British magazine called Argosy, and this is a digest magazine. So it looks like a paperback book. And this particular issue, it's got Ray's name on the cover, and this contains one Bradbury story, which, if memory serves, is just a reprint. Let's see what this is. This contains The Green Machine. That's right. The Green Machine is a story that is normally in Dandelion Wine. And I knew this issue contained the story. What I didn't know until I bought it was whether there were any illustrations in Argosy, because I like pictures. And the answer is no. There are no illustrations in Argosy. So let me just put this one down and show you this one. 1 shilling and sixpence from March 1951. So Ray's career rose up from the pulp magazines. Once he'd risen out of the pulps and he was able to be published in the slick magazines, he never went back to the pulps, really. And the pulps died out by, I suppose, the 1950s. The pulp magazines were generally giving way to digest-size magazines. I mean, this is from 1951, British. Britain didn't really have pulp magazines in quite the same way. But in the US, the pulp magazines began to die out in the 1950s. Really, I think television would have been the last nail in the coffin, because people who would have bought pulp magazines for the adventure stories, who might listen to radio dramas of, I don't know, The Lone Ranger and Gunsmoke, radio versions of those shows, would then see them turning up on TV. So people would watch them on TV. They'd stop listening to the radio. As we know, radio went into decline in the 1950s, or at least became something else. It tended to shift into focusing onto music, news and weather. So there was this big shift in those media. Pulp magazines died off pretty much. Okay, so that's the background to where Ray's stories would appear. Now, let me show you some of the things I use other than these primary sources for getting information on Ray's stories. The very first thing I would refer to always is this magnificent book called Ray Bradbury, The Life of Fiction, and you'll have heard me talk about this many times. It's an excellent resource. It's a very thick book, and it's a scholarly book. It's published by a university press, so it's really a work of scholarship, but it is very readable, and it contains material by, well, let me hold it up again, the two authors, Jonathan R. Eller and William F. Toupont. Now, I knew both of these guys. John Eller is a good friend of mine still. Bill Toupont passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. And these were the two founders of the Ray Bradbury Center, which is at Indiana University, Indianapolis. And I've been a consultant to the centre for a number of years. And John and Bill, when they first established the Bradbury Centre, were doing joint scholarship on Bradbury, and this was the prime work that they produced just before forming the Bradbury Centre. What's great about this book, Bill contributes these scholarly studies of Ray's work. Almost everything that Ray wrote, Bill has written about in here. And John provides the historical background and the bibliographic detail. So this book tells you really how everything that Ray wrote was written. And there's some fascinating tales of how Ray put his books together. And at the back of the book, this section here is the appendix or the appendices, and this contains all sorts of information which I find invaluable. Let me show you an example. We've got a year-by-year listing of all the stories that Ray published. Now, when I'm doing my chronological Bradbury episodes, that's exactly what I want. I need to know each year which stories were published, where were they published, and all the information is in here. 1938, the first year of Ray's career. Look, we've got 3 stories: Hollebocken's Dilemma, The Death of Mr. McCarthy, and Hollebocken Comes Back. And next to them, you see these curious numbers: 38-1, 38-2, 38-3. This is John Eller's scheme for keeping track of Bradbury's stories. Each story has a number which begins with the year. In this case, 38 indicates 1938, and then a dash, and then another number, and that second number shows the order of publication within that year. So if we go back to this one again, 3 stories: 38-1, 38-2, 38-3. Then we move on to the year 1939, and the numbering sequence now starts 39-1, and then it'll go 39-2, 39-3. So these are what I call the Eller references. So this is a fantastic resource for me to find out where these stories first appeared. But I also have my own website where I have a version of this that everyone can access, but I access it as well. People, as I say, people think I've got all this information up here. I have not. But I have got it at my fingertips, and some of the information that I use in my podcasts is on my website. So let me just go to my website. Let me show you this. So this is Bradbury Media. It's my website. Hey, look, I'm doing a Bradbury 100 live on the 22nd of August. Yes. Over on the right-hand side, I have Ray Bradbury books. Click on that, and it will tell you all the books Ray published decade by decade. And down the bottom, in the yellow box, is my short story finder. Click on that, and you're taken to the short story finder. The main purpose of this short story finder is for you, if you know a short story and you want to know which book is it in, you can come to this, find the story, and it will tell you. So let me give you an example. If I go on H, here's a list of all the stories beginning with H. Let's have a look for Hollebocken's Dilemma. Here it is, Hollebocken's Dilemma. Let's just highlight that. Hollebocken's Dilemma, with the Eller reference from the book 3801, published in 1938, and it was the first story that Ray published in that year. The next column tells you where that story can be found. Now, Hollebocken's Dilemma has only appeared in an anthology called Horrors Unseen, edited by Sam Moskowitz, 1974. So if you wanted to read that story, that's the place you have to go. Well, actually, since I put this together, the story has turned up somewhere else, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But back to this. So we've got the title of the story, the Eller reference, where it was originally published, where you can find it, and in the last column, where it was first published. So if all you want to do is read the story, you can use this column, because it tells you where you can find the story in a current or recently published book. And if you're a completist and who has to read every story in the original text, you need this column, because it tells you where to go and look for the original. Okay, so those are 2 fundamental resources that I use all the time. The Life of Fiction has all that detail in it. My own website has the information. Of course, it's searchable, so it has the advantage, and I tend to go first to my own web page. Now, in recent times, we've also had these volumes. This is volume 1 of The Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition. This again is a scholarly work published by Kent State University Press. The first volume of this was edited by our 2 friends, Bill Touponce and John Eller. And I believe it was Bill Touponce's idea to begin this book series, to collect all of Ray's fiction. And I think John Eller was perhaps a bit sceptical at first, saying, why would you bother to do that when all the stories are already out there? You know, all of Ray's books are still in print, with the exception of Dark Carnival. Why collect them together? People can get the stories very easily anyway. And it was Bill Touponce's idea to look for Ray's first settled version of a story. I'm trying to get the terminology right, because when I use words like definitive, I get told off because nothing is definitive, and this is not definitive. It doesn't aim to be definitive. But what this book does do is aim to give you the first settled version of Ray's text, knowing that Ray rewrote stuff and re-edited his material later on. The aim of these books is to get back to the first, if you like, the first published version of a text. Now, there were 3 volumes of this. The very first volume said something like, and again, let me get this right, each volume in the proposed 3-volume edition includes a general introduction, blah, blah, blah. So on the cover of this first volume, it refers to it being a proposed 3-volume series, and 3 volumes were published, and here they are. So 3 volumes were published. Some people are saying, well, when's the next one coming out? When's volume 4 coming out? Well, I'm sorry to say, only 3 were contracted for at the beginning, and 3 have been published. So, you know, what the publisher said they were going to do, they've done. So anyway, the Collected Stories is a great resource. One of the reasons why this is such a valuable book, and the other 2 are valuable books, is they do publish the first text of each story. Sometimes those have been lost to the mists of time because Ray has rewritten the story and let the new version become the standard version and let the old version disappear. So this book lets you get back to those originals. Because only 3 volumes have been published, really, we've only got the level of scrutiny that these books give you up till 1944. So after that, once my chronological Bradbury episodes have gone beyond 1944, I'm on my own. I haven't got these Eller and Touponce books to rely on, except for The Life of Fiction, which is always there and covers the vast bulk of Ray's career. So those are some primary sources that I use. I mean, they're not primary sources in the sense that a historian uses the term. I should have said main resources that I use. Other things that I use are the authorised biography of Ray Bradbury, which I'm not going to dwell on, but it's out there if you want it. There's also, better to my mind, this, Ray Bradbury Unbound. There's a series of 3 books here. Again, look, it's our friend John Eller. He wrote a 3-volume biography of Ray Bradbury, and this goes into much more detail than the so-called authorised biography. This is not a scholarly work so much as other things that John Eller has published. I mean, it is a scholarly work in that he is a scholar and he has uncovered new facts and information through research. So it's a scholarly work in that sense, but it's highly readable because John is a very transparent writer, and these are excellent books. These cover the whole of Bradbury's writing career, and they go, they get to Bradbury's motivations as well as the facts of what Bradbury did. So these are very useful books to look at. As I say, there's 3 in the series. And then there's another one that I always refer to, another big heavy book, Bradbury, An Illustrated Life. If I'm struggling to read what I'm holding up, it's because I'm looking in a little monitor over there. So yeah, Bradbury, An Illustrated Life. This one is the one that contains lots of pictures. So there's some great internal illustrations from pulp magazines that Ray appeared in. There are, let's find some colour ones as well. Reproductions of colour illustrations from the Slick magazines that Ray's stories appeared in, and loads of reproductions of book covers and so on. So again, a very useful resource. Sometimes if there's a particular magazine that I don't have a copy of, I can go and look in here, and quite often Jerry Wiest, who edited this book, provides a scan of a cover or an interior page. So those can be useful if I literally can't get hold of a magazine. But then there are some wonderful online resources that provide you with old magazines. So let me show you some of these. Perhaps the most famous, of course, is the Internet Archive, archive.org. And ignore the Wayback Machine, but instead go for the general search on the Internet Archive. And for example, if you search for Weird Tales, you will find there's an awful lot of old Weird Tales magazines online. Now, I can't remember with Weird Tales whether they're all on there. I don't think they are all on there. There are usually gaps in these collections. But basically, somebody somewhere, and it's lots of different people, somebody somewhere has taken one of these and scanned the whole thing. And these are fantastic. This is where I get, to be honest, a lot of the information for my podcasts and other things. And when I'm doing talks, public speaking and that kind of thing, I always like to use copious illustrations. So, grabbing the illustrations from a pulp magazine like this is a great way of enlivening my talks. So I am intimately familiar with all these old pulp magazines that you find online. So the Internet Archive is a fantastic resource for this. Many of these are out of copyright, and officially archive.org will only reproduce a thing if it is in the public domain, officially. But there's a load of stuff on there that is really still copyrighted. But we won't go into all the detail on that. That's a discussion for another time. So archive.org is an excellent place to look. Another place to look, and again, you'll have heard me talk about this on the podcast, fanac.org is the Fan History Project, and this has a collection of fanzines. So if we go looking at the alphabetical listing of fanzines, if I click on F and scroll through, I will be able to find it's a long way down, so I'm going to search within the page for Futuria Fantasia. And here it is, Futuria Fantasia. And this is Ray Bradbury's own fanzine from 1939 and 1940, when he was 18, 19 and 20 years old. So there we go. So there are 4 issues of Futuria Fantasia, and they are reproduced here. Now, these are actually taking them from Project Gutenberg, but I always go to Fanac, and the reason I go to Fanac is because it hasn't just got stuff that is on Project Gutenberg. Project Gutenberg, if you don't know, is a collection of public domain works, books, magazines, all sorts of things. Fanac is specifically about fan activity. So there are fanzines, there are convention programs, all sorts of things to do with science fiction fans. So that's another lovely resource that I go to. And there are various other collections of pulp magazines online. There's one called UNZ or UNZ that I use occasionally because, again, it has scans of magazines. And I tend to use this if I can't find a thing on archive.org. I'll come and have a look on the UNZ or UNZ review. And here, for example, is on that website. They've got a copy of the American Mercury from August 1945, a quite obscure magazine. Very difficult to get hold of a copy of this, but it contains a Bradbury story, and it should have just downloaded it there, I think. And there it is. So this is one of Ray's stories that appears in The Golden Apples of the Sun. It's the story about the baseball game. And there it is, the first appearance of that story in full text, courtesy of the UNZ review. And there's a few other websites as well that collect pulp magazines. So I tend to look in all of these places when I'm looking for the original text. Other things that I look at Conversations with Ray Bradbury, which is a book edited by Stephen Agelis. And this it was originally research that Agelis did for his, I think it was for his PhD. So it was originally his PhD thesis. It's a collection of interviews with Bradbury over decades, starting very early in his career and going through to his very late career. So when I want to know what Ray said about a story, this is one of the things I go to. I've also got Stephen Agelis's PhD thesis, which has a bit more content, so I'm able to search through that. And of course, I go to the two big short story collections. These are the really heavy ones. This is where you get your daily workout. The Stories of Ray Bradbury, which is from about 1980, contains 100 short stories. Bradbury Stories, which is from around 2000-ish, something like that, contains another 100 stories, but it's a different 100 stories to the 100 in there. So 200 Ray Bradbury stories. And remember what I said earlier, Ray published over 400 short stories. So imagine that, if those were all put together in hardbound books. 100, 200, 300, 400. Yeah, that would keep you fit, carrying those around. So those are my major places to look. Typically, when I'm doing a chronological Bradbury, I'm looking to find out, for a given year, which stories were published. I'll give an account of each story, so a very brief plot summary. I'll talk about how it came to be written, if I know. I mean, I don't always know that, but sometimes Ray will have talked about it in the afterword to one of his books, or in an interview or a speech or something like that, lecture. So where possible, I will talk about the origins of the story. If I don't have that information, I will really just talk about what the story's about and whether it's any good, whether people should seek it out. And I'll talk about the books that you can find the story in, the magazines it's appeared in, and so on. And then I'll move on to the next story. I try to apportion the time to the more significant stories. But of course, early in Bradbury's career, in 1938, he published 3 really very insignificant stories. And of those 3, only 2 have survived. One of the stories from 1938, The Death of Mr. McCarthy, I've never seen. And I don't know that anybody has a copy of it. So what I'm doing with the chronological Bradbury, from the listener's point of view, is giving an account of Bradbury's developing career. And we're just getting to the interesting bit, really, because we've reached 1943 or thereabouts. And in 1943, these are my notes for the next 2 chronological Bradburys that I'm going to do. In 1943, we have 11 stories published. So Ray is now 22 or 23 years old, and 11 of his stories get published. And they're no longer in fanzines. Everything now is in professional magazines, mostly in pulps. So if we look here, we've got The Piper is from Thrilling Wonder Stories. That's a pulp magazine that I held up earlier on. The Wind appeared in Weird Tales magazine, another pulp. Captain Future, another pulp. astonishing stories, and so on. And in the right-hand column, these are my notes just for me, to help me talk around the subject. I've put where the stories can be found. I've also got a little note over here as to whether the story is copyrighted or in the public domain. Of the 11 stories published in 1943, they are all still copyrighted, with the exception of The Wind. Why do I make a note of that? Why do I think that's important? Well, that gives me the potential, if I wish, to read the story as part of the podcast. Now, some podcast listeners, I'm sure, as soon as I start saying, today I'm going to read you a story, I'm sure some people immediately press skip or stop. But I do occasionally on the podcast read stories. And this has led to some people to say, why don't you do that more often? Because although I joke about people switching off, some people actually would like to hear Bradbury stories being read. Why don't you read them? Well, the reason I don't read them is because they're copyrighted for the most part, and I would have to pay. And my podcast is not a commercial podcast. I don't have any funding. I don't have Patreons or advertising on my podcast. So therefore, what I do has to cost me nothing. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. And I'm not going to pay to read a copyrighted story. I couldn't afford it. Honestly, these stories are expensive if you want the publication rights to them, especially if it's unlimited public rights, unlimited publication rights in an electronic form. It would cost me an awful lot of money. But just occasionally, we come across a story which is in the public domain. And I remember in a previous episode of my podcast, I did a reading of Rocket Summer. Not the first chapter of The Martian Chronicles, because that is copyrighted, but Ray wrote an earlier story called Rocket Summer, which is a totally different story. And that one is out of copyright. So I was able to read that on the podcast. So yeah, for 1943, which is what I'm currently working on, there are 11 stories. So I'm going to have to split that across 2 podcast episodes. And finally, just got a couple of minutes left, so I'll mention a couple of books that have come out since the last one of these, since the last Bradbury 100 Live. There is this lovely book called Remembrance, Selected Correspondence of Ray Bradbury, and it's by our good friend John Eller. John is undoubtedly the leading expert on Ray Bradbury, and Remembrance is correspondence. It's not complete correspondence, it really is a selection. It's very carefully curated, and there are lots of different themes that are being followed. And in here, I still haven't read all of this book. I've dipped into it to look at the chapters that really interest me. But you'll see correspondence in here between Ray and his writer friends, between Ray and his heroes, his mentors, his collaborators. There's a whole load of stuff, and it's really very fascinating. So if you're interested in Ray's life and career, this is a fascinating book. I think the thing that always comes across to me is that whatever Ray was in his career, he remained a fanboy. And he was not afraid of writing a fan letter to people whose work he appreciated. And I'm sure there would have been some people who just didn't write back and he never heard from them again. But in many cases, he would write to them and they would write back, and a friendship would be established. So Ray was friends with an enormous number of famous and creative people. So this is a fascinating snapshot, a sampling, if you like, of Ray's correspondence. Another book which has come out since the last Bradbury Live, and I'm just going to check the copyright date to see when it officially did come out. Yeah, this one is officially 2024. And it's Dark Carnival. Now, Dark Carnival, I've done videos. I've got a video on YouTube about Dark Carnival and its origin and what happened to Dark Carnival. It was Ray Bradbury's first book, and it was published by Arkham House and it was allowed to go out of print. Ray actually bought up the remaining copies from the publisher, and he basically decided that he didn't want Dark Carnival to be out there anymore because he wanted to reconsider the stories. So this is a very nice book to have if you're interested in the early Bradbury. This really does transport you back to 1947 because it doesn't have the rewrites of the stories. It has the original text. And this one in the UK, this is $9.99. So in the US, you'll probably pay a similar amount, and then you'll obviously pay for shipping on top of that. But well worth having if you don't already have it. Okay, I'm out of time, folks. Thank you very much for joining me on this live stream. I guess I'm committed to doing this forever. Well, at least another year, because then I can say this is the 5th and final one of these. But I enjoy doing these, and I thought usually I do a sort of a semi-scripted thing with a pre-prepared PowerPoint, and I thought today I would do something a little bit more freeform. I hope it's worked for you. Let me know in the comments. Please, if you've reached this far, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe using the thingy at the bottom of the thing. If you're watching this on Facebook, click on like. If you've left any comments during the live show, I didn't really think that I could handle comments while also handling all the technology and all the books and all of that. So I haven't looked at comments during the live show, but the minute I end the live stream, I'm going to go and look, see if there are any comments, and I'll post replies on there. Thank you very much. Look out for Bradbury 100. Go to your phone, look at your podcast app, subscribe to Bradbury 100, and it will pick up all the new episodes as they appear. And this recording, I will endeavour to keep this on Facebook in case you want to come back to it or in case you missed any part of it. And I'll also make sure there's a version permanently on YouTube. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.